As Bryan talked to the manager, Samantha couldn't help but stare at him. Everything felt like a dream to her. She admired his face. "Get a grip of yourself, Samantha," she thought, patting her chest. "Let's go." Bryan wrapped his arms around her neck as they walked out of the restaurant. "Is kinda dark." "What's the time?" Samantha asked, and Bryan stared at his watch. 5:20 p.m., Bryan muttered, and Samantha gasped. "My mom is home. Damn, I wanted to make medicines for her." "Let's go together, and by the ways, is your mom sick?" Bryan asked, playing with her hair. "She has a heart disease," Samantha muttered tearfully. "The doctor said she has only 3 weeks to live. I always make that medicine to relieve some pains in her chest," Samantha said, and Bryan used his thumbs to clean her tears. "Is going to be okay." Bryan pecked her parted lips before grabbing her hands softly, and they walked to where the car was. He opened the car door for her, and she sat down before opening for himself. Then he sat down and ignited the engine before driving away. Bryan wiped her tears with his thumbs from time to time, any time he hears her sniffles, until he didn't hear a sound, not even a tiny bit. He turned to see Samantha sleeping, and his eyes softened more than before. He smiled as he stopped the car in front of her mum's place and carried her in a bridal style into the house. And indeed, he saw Mrs. Ann, Samantha's mum. That's what Bryan calls her when he was little. He saw Mrs. Ann sitting on a chair. She looked like someone in deep thoughts. But immediately, she sensed that someone entered the house. She looked at the entrance where Bryan was standing. "Good evening, Mrs. Ann." Bryan smiled as he entered, and Mrs. Ann, seeing Samantha sleeping in his arms, broke into a smile. "Bryan, how are you? How about your parents?" Mrs. Ann asked, and Bryan smiled. "They are fine, Mrs. Ann," Bryan said, and carried Samantha to her room. He placed her on the bed and covered her with a duvet. "I love you." Bryan smiled and kissed her forehead, letting his lips linger there for a moment before letting go. Then he walked out of the room. "Mrs. Ann, I will take my leave." Bryan smiled, but a thought suddenly crossed through his mind. "Mrs. Ann, with your permission, can I use the kitchen to prepare a herbal drink for you?" Bryan smiled, and Mrs. Ann raised an eyebrow. "Okay." She smiled, and he walked to the kitchen and brought out some ingredients from his bag. "This will be manageable at least." Bryan bit his lower lips and set to work. Some minutes later, Bryan poured it into a glass cup and brought it to the sitting room. He gave it to Mrs. Ann, who thanked him immediately and drank it. "Is not that bitter? If it was Samantha that prepared it, it will be so bitter. I guess she wants to kill me faster than the time the doctor said I would die," Mrs. Ann thought, as she placed the empty glass on the table. "Thank you so much, Bryan." Mrs. Ann smiled appreciatedly. "Is nothing." "Mrs. Anna." Bryan smiled and zipped his bag before walking out of the house. At a business meeting, "Thanks, Mr. Jones, for your cooperation," a man wearing suit muttered as he shook hands with Adrian's father, known as Mr. Jones, while Adrian was beside him. "Yes," Mr. Jones muttered and nodded at his PA, who left. "You said you wanted to speak to me directly," Mr. Jones said, and he nodded. "Is about—" "Dad!" A girly voice cut him off, and a girl walked in with a blue gown and black high heels, and it showed Lily. "Sorry on behalf of my daughter for the interruptment, Mr. Jones and Sir Adrian. Meet Lily, my daughter," Mr. Jackson said, and Lily's eyes widened when she saw Adrian. Even Adrian had the same expression. "I think they know each other," Mr. Jones muttered. "Yeah, they met in school. My daughter always come back from school chanting, 'Adrian is so handsome, Adrian this and that,'" Mr. Jackson said, and Mr. Jones raised up his head proudly. "Of course, he got it from me." "This is so embarrassing," Lily thought, as a blush spread around her cheeks. "That's not fair, Dad," Lily thought with a frown. At Jeremy's mansion, Jeremy smirked as he held the video recorder. "I can't suffer like this. I can't marry that witch," Jeremy thought, as he watched as his parents made Mandy to sit on the couch to watch movies with them. He quickly tapped a button on his phone, and a video displayed on the screen. "Baby, remove your clothes. I want you now," an old man said, kissing Mandy's neck, while Mandy mained like a maniac. The other things were blank, but they could hear moans. "Don't kill your baby, so go easy on me," Mandy muttered. I never did such a thing. I know I pretended to be pregnant, but I did it. Because I love him." Mandy knelt down. "That video is all a lie," Mandy added. "So the beach isn't even pregnant, though the video is edited, but never knew I was so smart," Jeremy thought with a smirk. "No more wedding, now free as a bird. Am going to celebrate this with a lot of hot chicks," Jeremy thought. "We understand you, dear." "What?" Jeremy screamed, glaring at his parents. "Is that a girl witch? How come she tied his parents with her evil spells?